You think you know about slavery. You've read about the Middle Passage, learned about the cotton plantations, studied the Underground Railroad, 400 years of human bondage that scarred a continent and shaped the modern world. But what if I told you that this horror story, as devastating as it was, represents merely a single chapter in a much darker book? What if there existed another slave empire, one that operated not for 4 centuries, but for 14? An empire that didn't just exploit human bodies, but systematically erased entire civilizations from the face of the earth. A machine so perfectly designed for human destruction that it transformed suffering into mathematical precision, turning the theft of children into state policy and the annihilation of cultures into economic strategy. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't revisionist fantasy. What you're about to discover exists in Ottoman tax records, Islamic legal documents, and archaeological evidence that has been methodically catalogued, verified, and then carefully ignored by mainstream academia. The evidence sits in dusty archives from Istanbul to Cairo, in satellite imagery revealing ancient trade routes, and in the genetic absence of entire peoples who should still walk this earth today. For over a millennium, while European powers were still emerging from feudalism, a vast network of slave markets, castration centers, and human trafficking routes operated across 3 continents. This system didn't just take lives, it erased them so completely that their descendants cannot even demand justice today, because those descendants simply don't exist. The Atlantic slave trade, for all its horrors, left behind 42 million descendants who could eventually fight for freedom, build monuments, and ensure their story would be told. But this other empire, it was designed with a different purpose entirely, not just to exploit its victims, but to erase them from history itself. We've been taught to see slavery through a single lens, to understand human trafficking through one historical framework. But what happens when you realize that everything you learned was just the visible tip of an iceberg? What happens when you discover that the most systematic, most efficient, most devastating slave empire in human history has been hiding in plain sight? The story begins where you'd least expect it, not in cotton fields or sugar plantations, but in quiet Christian villages where the sound of children playing would suddenly stop, where parents faced a choice no human being should ever have to make, where the very concept of childhood became a luxury that entire communities could no longer afford. Let me take you to those villages, to that moment when innocence died and an empire fed on the tears of mothers. Picture a spring morning in 1453. The Balkan countryside awakens to what should be another ordinary day. Farmers tending their fields, children chasing chickens through village squares, mothers hanging laundry in the crisp mountain air. Then the drums begin. Not the celebratory drums of a festival, but the methodical, measured beat that every Christian family in the Ottoman Empire had learned to dread. The Devshirme officials have arrived. They call it recruitment, but the word masks a reality far more sinister. These aren't soldiers seeking volunteers. They're state-sanctioned kidnappers operating under imperial decree. The Devshirme system, institutionalized in the 14th century, represents perhaps history's most organized form of child abduction, transforming human theft into administrative routine. The process unfolds with bureaucratic precision that would make modern corporations envious. Ottoman officials carry detailed registers, noting the age, health, and intellectual capacity of boys between 8 and 18. They examine teeth like horse traders, measure height and shoulder width, test reflexes and memory. The strongest, brightest, and most beautiful children receive a checkmark, a death sentence disguised as selection. This isn't random violence. It's systematic harvesting. Every 3 to 7 years, these human collectors sweep through Christian villages from Albania to Georgia, from Bulgaria to Bosnia. The quota system demands approximately 3,000 boys annually during peak periods, with some regions losing up to 1/5 of their male children in a single collection cycle. The officials maintain meticulous records, names, ages, villages of origin, physical descriptions. These ledgers, preserved in Ottoman archives, read like livestock inventories. Theodoros, son of Nicola, age 12, brown hair, strong build, quick learner. Dragan, son of Petar, age 10, blonde, excellent memory, suitable for palace service. Human beings reduced to breeding stock evaluations. The selection criteria reveal the Empire's strategic thinking. They prefer boys aged 8 to 12, old enough to survive the journey, but young enough for complete psychological reconstruction. Intelligence matters more than mere physical strength. The Empire seeks raw material for its elite units, not just manual laborers. Orphans are rejected. Family bonds must be severed, not absent from the start. The timing follows military calendars. Major recruitment drives coincide with planned conquests, ensuring fresh troops for upcoming campaigns. Regional governors receive specific orders: collect 500 boys from Serbian districts, extract 300 from Albanian territories. The human cost gets calculated like military supplies, so many units needed for the next war machine. What makes this system uniquely horrifying isn't just its scale, but its efficiency. Unlike random raids or chaotic warfare, the Devshirme operates as smoothly as tax collection. Villagers know when the collectors are coming. Families count down the years until their sons reach the vulnerable age range. Entire communities live in perpetual terror of a process as predictable as harvesting seasons. The Ottoman Empire didn't stumble into this system. They perfected it. They created an industrial process for stealing childhoods, complete with quality control measures, performance metrics, and bureaucratic oversight. They turned human abduction into government policy. But the selection process was only the beginning. The real horror lay in what happened after those checkmarks were made, when desperate parents realized their children had just become property of an empire that specialized in erasing identities forever. The moment that checkmark appears beside a child's name, time stops. Everything a family has built, their hopes, their legacy, their reason for existing, crystallizes into a single, desperate question. How do you save your child from a system designed to consume him? Some parents tried bribery first. Village records from Bosnia describe farmers offering their entire harvest, their livestock, even their land deeds to Ottoman officials. A blacksmith in Herzegovina reportedly melted down his tools and life savings, 40 years of accumulated wealth, pressing the gold into trembling hands that pushed it back with practiced indifference. The system had seen every form of desperation. Corruption would only complicate the administrative process. When money failed, some turned to violence. In 1438, a group of Serbian fathers attacked a Devshirme convoy, killing 2 janissaries before being overwhelmed. They knew the consequences. Entire villages faced collective punishment for such defiance. Yet they fought anyway, choosing certain death over the slower agony of watching their children disappear. But the most heartbreaking resistance came from love itself. Ottoman records, with their bureaucratic coldness, document cases that reveal the depths of parental anguish. Rejected, subject missing 2 fingers, left hand. Behind this clinical notation lies an unthinkable reality. A father or mother deliberately mutilating their own child, choosing physical disability over spiritual destruction. In Bulgarian villages, parents would break their sons' bones just before collection time. A limp, a withered arm, blindness in one eye, any defect that might render a boy unsuitable for military service. The calculations were brutal. Better a crippled son at home than a perfect soldier lost forever to the empire. Some tried subtler approaches. Families would deliberately malnourish their children for months before collection, hoping gaunt faces and hollow cheeks might fool the inspectors. Others used herbal concoctions to induce temporary illnesses, high fevers, skin rashes, anything to create the appearance of chronic weakness. The saddest cases involved mothers who would scar their own children's faces. Beautiful boys attracted special attention for palace service, so parents would take knives to perfect features, carving deliberate disfigurements. Imagine the horror. A mother's hand, which should caress and protect, instead wielding a blade against her beloved child's face. These weren't acts of cruelty, but of devastating love. Each scar represented a prayer. Please find my son unsuitable. Please let his imperfections save him. Yet even these desperate measures often failed. The empire's hunger for young lives was so vast that collectors learned to recognize deliberate injuries. Suspicious wounds led to investigations, investigations led to punishments, and punishments fell upon entire communities. The most tragic irony: many children whose parents had saved them through mutilation later envied those taken by the Devshirme, watching from their villages as former playmates returned as powerful officials while they remained trapped in peasant obscurity. But what happened to those who couldn't be saved? Those perfect, healthy, intelligent boys whose only crime was meeting the empire's standards for human raw material. The boy who enters the Ottoman training system and the man who emerges are two entirely different human beings. What happens between those moments represents perhaps history's most sophisticated program of psychological destruction and reconstruction. A process so thorough that victims become not just willing participants, but enthusiastic architects of their own people's suffering. The transformation begins immediately. Names disappear first. Dragan becomes Hassan, Goran becomes Suleiman, Theodoros becomes Osman. This isn't mere administrative convenience, it's psychological warfare. A name carries identity, family connections, cultural memory. Erase the name, and you begin erasing the soul. The boys are scattered across the empire, deliberately separated from anyone who might remember their origins. Brothers are sent to different provinces, village companions divided among distant training centers. The empire understands that shared memories of home create dangerous bonds of resistance. Islamic conversion comes next, but not through gentle persuasion. The process combines religious instruction with systematic punishment for any display of Christian identity. Speaking Slavic languages earns beatings. Making the sign of the cross brings starvation. Mentioning parents or siblings results in extended isolation. The message is clear. Your past is not just wrong, it's forbidden. The educational system operates like advanced behavioral conditioning. Exceptional students receive privileges, comfortable quarters, and promises of future power. Those who resist face physical punishment, social isolation, and psychological torment. The empire creates competition among the boys, turning former neighbors into rivals fighting for imperial approval. Most insidious is the gradual introduction of Islamic superiority doctrine. Teachers don't just demand religious conversion, they systematically demolish the boys' cultural heritage. Christianity becomes depicted as ignorant superstition, Slavic traditions as barbaric customs, their former communities as backward peasant societies. The boys learn to see their own origins as shameful mistakes that the empire has graciously corrected. Physical training interweaves with psychological conditioning. Combat skills develop alongside religious devotion. Military discipline merges with Islamic ritual. The boys learn that strength comes through submission to Allah and the Sultan, the very forces that destroyed their families. The most successful graduates display a chilling enthusiasm for their transformation. They genuinely believe the empire saved them from inferior lives, rescued them from ignorant communities, elevated them above their humble origins. They don't just accept their new identities, they embrace them with converts' fervor. Consider Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, born Bajika Sokolovic in a Serbian village. Taken at age 12, he rose through the ranks to become Grand Vizier, the empire's second most powerful man. In 1566, he commanded Ottoman forces that conquered his own homeland, personally overseeing the destruction of Serbian fortresses, while his birth family likely watched from nearby hills. This wasn't betrayal, it was complete psychological reconstruction. The Serbian boy had been so thoroughly erased that the Ottoman official genuinely saw himself as liberating backward territories from Christian ignorance. He had become the perfect weapon, a Serbian who hated Serbia, a Christian-born Muslim who destroyed churches, a son who forgot his parents while serving their enemies. But if the empire could accomplish such psychological mastery over children, imagine what they did to the adults they captured, men whose bodies could be transformed just as completely as these boys' minds. Welcome to history's most profitable mutilation industry. where human castration operated not as isolated cruelty, but as sophisticated economic enterprise. The numbers tell a story that business schools would study if they had the stomach for it. Transform a 50-dinar male slave into a 200-dinar eunuch through a single surgical procedure. The profit margins were extraordinary when the patient survived. The demand drove everything. Islamic palaces across 3 continents required thousands of eunuchs for administrative positions, harem supervision, and religious duties. Castrated men posed no sexual threat to rulers' wives and concubines, making them invaluable for intimate palace service. The Ottoman Sultan's Topkapi Palace alone employed over 600 eunuchs at its peak, while wealthy merchants, governors, and religious leaders each maintained their own smaller collections. This wasn't cottage industry, it was mass production. Major castration centers operated in Aswan, Egypt, Khiva in Central Asia, and various locations throughout the Ottoman territories. These facilities processed thousands of victims annually, functioning with the efficiency of modern abattoirs. The operators had perfected their techniques not for humanitarian reasons, but for economic ones. Damaged merchandise meant financial loss. The pricing structure reveals the calculated brutality. An intact adult male slave sold for approximately 50 dinars at Constantinople's markets. Boys were cheaper, around 30-40 dinars depending on age and condition. But successfully castrated eunuchs commanded premium prices, 150 to 200 dinars for adults, up to 300 dinars for particularly young or attractive specimens. The most prized were white eunuchs from Slavic territories, who could fetch 400-500 dinars in elite markets. Simple mathematics drove the industry's expansion. Even with catastrophic mortality rates, the profit potential remained irresistible. Consider a batch of 100 male slaves purchased for 5,000 dinars total. If only 15 to 20 survived the castration process, a typical success rate, but each sold for 200 dinars, the gross revenue reached 3,000 to 4,000 dinars. Factor in operational costs, transportation, and medical expenses, and profits still exceeded 50% on successful operations. The traders maintained detailed ledgers tracking their investments. Damascus merchant records from the 15th century list human castration like any other business venture. Purchased 200 Circassian boys, ages 8 to 12, total cost 8,000 dinars. Processed 180, 20 died in transport. Post-operation survivors, 28. Expected revenue, 6,000 dinars. Estimated profit, 2,500 dinars after expenses. Regional specialization emerged based on market demands. Egyptian centers focused on African slaves destined for Mamluk territories. Crimean operations processed Slavic captives for Ottoman palaces. Central Asian facilities served Persian and Mongol markets. Each developed signature techniques designed to maximize survival rates for their specific clientele. Quality control became paramount. Buyers inspected eunuchs as carefully as prize livestock, checking for proper healing, absence of infection, and complete removal of sexual organs. Incomplete castrations were worthless. The entire point was eliminating sexual capability. This demand for quality products drove operators to refine their methods constantly. The most successful castration centers employed specialized surgeons, maintained sterile facilities, and developed post-operative care protocols. Not from compassion, but from profit motive. Dead slaves generated zero revenue. Properly healed eunuchs commanded premium prices. Economic incentives accidentally created the closest thing to medical care these victims ever received. But understanding the business model only begins to reveal the horror. The real nightmare lay in the operational details, the actual process that transformed screaming children into profitable merchandise at a 90% mortality rate. The word surgery implies healing. What happened in Aswan, Egypt, and other castration centers across the empire had nothing to do with medicine. It was human butchery on an industrial scale, performed with tools that belonged in a blacksmith's forge, not an operating theater. The goal was never the patient's survival, only the procedure's success. This brutal indifference is where the mathematics of death become truly horrifying. Let's follow the journey of 1,000 boys captured in a Central African raid. First came the march to a processing center, a filter designed by nature and cruelty. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion would claim 300 to 400 of them before they ever saw a surgeon's blade. Of the 600 or 700 who arrived, they then faced the procedure itself. Contemporary accounts and archaeological evidence paint a gruesome picture. Conducted in unsterile conditions, with no anesthetic, the operation had a mortality rate that hovered around 90%. Let's perform the disgusting math. Of the 600 boys who entered the facility, 540 would die from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. This leaves only 60 survivors. From an initial group of 1,000, a mere 60 to 70 boys would live to become the finished product. That represents a total mortality rate of 93 to 94% from capture to recovery. It is a number that strains belief, yet it is consistently supported by merchant records and the chilling evidence found in mass burial sites. Archaeologists excavating near these former centers have unearthed the proof: vast pits filled with the skeletal remains of boys and young men aged 7 to 16. There are no markers, no names, just the silent testimony of a business that treated dead children as an acceptable operating cost. The horrifying truth is that the high mortality rate wasn't a flaw in the system. It was a feature. It acted as an economic filter, artificially limiting the supply of eunuchs and driving up the price of the few who survived. Dead boys were a business expense. Living eunuchs were a premium luxury. The sheer volume of human raw material required to sustain this industry, with its catastrophic losses, points to a supply chain of unimaginable scale and cruelty. Where did this endless river of stolen lives come from? The answer lies in journeys even more deadly than the procedure itself, on the vast, unforgiving highways of the trans-Saharan slave trade. The trans-Saharan slave routes stretched like arteries of death across 3,000 miles of desert wasteland, carrying human cargo on journeys so brutal they made the Middle Passage look merciful by comparison. While historians meticulously document every ship that crossed the Atlantic, these desert highways of human misery have been deliberately forgotten, despite processing nearly twice as many victims over a period 3 times as long. Satellite imagery reveals the scope of this forgotten Holocaust. Advanced ground-penetrating radar along ancient caravan routes has uncovered continuous chains of human remains, skeletal evidence of the millions who never completed their journeys. Near the Bilma Oasis in Chad, archaeologists discovered a 2-mile stretch containing over 4,000 sets of leg shackles still attached to human bones, the metal preserved by desert conditions while the flesh vanished centuries ago. The mathematics of mortality paint a picture of systematic extermination. Trans-Saharan caravans typically departed with 80% more slaves than they expected to deliver, factoring death rates into their business models. A caravan leaving Lake Chad with 1,000 captives planned to arrive in Cairo with perhaps 200, 300 survivors. The 70–80% mortality rate wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was an accepted cost of doing business. Compare these numbers to the more familiar Atlantic trade. Approximately 12 million Africans were shipped to the Americas over 400 years, with roughly 10 to 15% dying during the Middle Passage. The Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean routes transported an estimated 17 million people over 400 years, but with mortality rates 5 times higher. The human cost becomes staggering when you realize that for every slave who reached Muslim markets, 3 to 4 others died along the way. Here lies the crucial difference that textbooks ignore. The Atlantic slave trade, despite its horrors, produced 42 million descendants living in the Americas today. These communities could eventually fight for freedom, preserve their histories, and demand justice. But the Islamic slave trade was designed differently. It was meant to consume people entirely. The evidence exists in what's missing: Genetic studies reveal virtually no trace of sub-Saharan African ancestry in Middle Eastern populations, despite 1,400 years of massive slave importation. Archaeological excavations in medieval Baghdad, Cairo, and Istanbul uncover abundant material evidence of slave markets, castration facilities, and burial grounds, but no established African communities, no cultural synthesis, no surviving descendants. Trade route documentation from medieval merchants describes the logistics with chilling efficiency. A 12th century Moroccan trader's journal details calculations. Purchased 800 slaves at Gao, expecting 250 to survive desert crossing. Revenue per survivor, 300 dinars. Total investment, 15,000 dinars. Projected profit, 30,000 dinars minus transport costs. Human lives reduced to commodity speculation. The routes themselves tell the story. Names like Skeleton Coast and Valley of Death weren't poetic flourishes. They were geographic landmarks created by centuries of human remains. Water sources became strategically controlled choke points where slave traders could eliminate the weak while preserving just enough survivors to maintain profitability. But even this industrial-scale human destruction pales beside what happened to those who survived the journey. Because while millions died crossing deserts, those who lived faced a fate specifically designed to ensure they would leave no trace of their existence. No children, no legacy, no voice to tell their story. The most efficient genocide is one that erases its victims so completely that history forgets they ever existed. If the trade in boys and men represented industrial-scale brutality, the trafficking of women and girls constituted something even more sinister. A systematic program of sexual enslavement that operated with the efficiency of modern corporations and the ruthlessness of organized crime syndicates. Kaffa, the Crimean port city, earned its reputation as the slave capital of the world through sheer volume. At its peak in the 15th and 16th centuries, this single market processed over 20,000 women annually, more human trafficking than most modern nations see in a decade. The harbour warehouses weren't storing grain or textiles. They were human holding facilities where teenage girls waited to learn their fates. The pricing structure revealed the market's calculated dehumanization. Slavic and Circassian women commanded premium prices. Their pale skin and European features made them exotic commodities in Middle Eastern markets. A blonde, blue-eyed girl of 14 might sell for 300 to 400 dinars, while darker-skinned captives from Africa or the Balkans brought 100 pounds and 150 dinars. Age mattered desperately. Girls aged 14 to 16 represented peak market value, while women over 25 became nearly worthless for harem service. The Ottoman imperial harem at Topkapi Palace epitomized this system's horrifying scale. At various periods, it housed between 800 to 2,000 women and girls, all slaves, all torn from their families, all existing solely for the Sultan's pleasure. These weren't willing concubines seeking advancement. They were kidnapped children who had their names, languages, and identities systematically erased. The palace records preserved in Ottoman archives read like inventory lists. Arrived, 50 Circassian girls ages 12 to 16. Quality, excellent. Assigned to preliminary training quarters. Disposed, 12 women, ages 20 to 24. Reason, failed to please. Method, strangled. The bureaucratic language masks industrial-scale sexual slavery operating under imperial authority. The most heartbreaking resistance came from families who understood their daughter's beauty was a death sentence. In Circassian communities, parents developed the agonizing practice of deliberately scarring their daughters' faces, taking knives to features they had once kissed goodnight, carving permanent disfigurements that might render the girls unsuitable for harem service. Imagine the psychology. Mothers who had spent years nurturing their daughters' beauty, braiding their hair, teaching them to carry themselves with grace, suddenly wielding blades against those same beloved faces. These weren't acts of cruelty, but of desperate love. Parents choosing to destroy their children's appearances rather than watch them disappear into sexual slavery. The scars often proved insufficient. Ottoman collectors learned to recognize deliberate disfigurement and began accepting even marked women for lower-tier harem positions. Beauty remained the primary criterion, but the empire's appetite for female slaves was so vast that even damaged merchandise found buyers. Inside the harems, systematic dehumanization continued. Women received Turkish names, underwent forced conversion to Islam, and faced severe punishment for speaking their native languages or practicing their original religions. Those who resisted faced torture, solitary confinement, or execution. Those who complied might rise within the harem hierarchy, but remained slaves whose children, if they had any, would become slaves or soldiers in turn. The most successful harem women sometimes achieved significant political influence, but always as property, never as free agents. Their power existed entirely at their master's discretion and could vanish instantly through execution, exile, or simple replacement by younger captives. Why has this industrial-scale sexual slavery been erased from historical consciousness, while other atrocities receive extensive documentation and commemoration? Why does a crime of this magnitude remain virtually unknown, while lesser atrocities dominate historical curricula worldwide? The answer reveals a conspiracy of silence that continues to this day, maintained by three powerful forces working in concert to bury inconvenient truths. First, a climate of academic intimidation silences scholars who dare to research this topic. Universities offer virtually no courses on this 1,400-year history. Professors who attempt serious study often face career obstacles. Funding disappears, publications get rejected, and tenure becomes more difficult. Pioneering researchers in adjacent fields have faced professional ostracism for documenting histories that challenge established narratives. Second, the complex web of global finance and politics creates institutional pressure. Leading Western universities receive billions in endowments from foreign funds, creating a climate where administrators may become hesitant to approve research that could displease major donors. At international forums, attempts to broaden the dialogue on historical atrocities are often met with unified resistance from powerful political blocs, effectively stalling the conversation. Third, and most crucially, this system was designed to leave no witnesses. The Atlantic slave trade, despite its horrors, created thriving descendant communities who could eventually demand justice, build memorials, and ensure their ancestors' suffering wouldn't be forgotten. But Islamic slavery operated differently. It was engineered to consume its victims entirely, leaving no surviving bloodlines to tell their stories. The boys were converted and turned against their own people. The men were castrated to prevent reproduction. The women bore children who became slaves themselves, creating no free generations. Entire ethnic groups simply vanished. This represents the perfect crime. Genocide so complete that it eliminated not just lives, but the very possibility of future justice. No descendant communities exist to demand reparations, to build museums, to lobby for historical recognition. The victims were erased so thoroughly that their absence doesn't even leave a visible gap in the historical record. We've traced the machine's components: child theft transformed into state policy, castration industrialized for profit, women commodified for sexual exploitation, entire civilizations ground into dust. Each element fed the others in a self-sustaining cycle of human destruction that operated longer than any empire in recorded history. But here's the question that should haunt every person who learns this story. If they could hide 14 centuries of systematic human destruction, erase tens of millions of lives from collective memory, and maintain that silence for generations, what other truths are still buried beneath the carefully constructed narratives we call history? What else don't we know